Hello and welcome to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Haugo. Today we are in the Reproductive System, Chapter 23, Part 3, and we will be talking about the female reproductive system. So let's start out with the female gonads, which are the ovaries. They are a pair of almond-shaped organs flanking the uterus on the lateral wall of the pelvis, and they are each about 3 centimeters by 1.5 centimeters by 1 centimeter in size. And as you can see in the picture, there is the ovary here, and it is on each side of the uterus. Functions of the ovary. The major function is produce ova, which are eggs, and then singular would be an ovum. And the production of ova is called oogenesis. Another function of the ovaries is to produce estrogen and progesterone. So oogenesis, as we talked about before, is the creation of an ovum or an egg. And this actually starts in fetal period for females as opposed to males, and it develops into a primary oocyte, and then the development stops until puberty, and then 1 ovum per month continues on through the whole cycle, and each ovum is contained in a follicle, and like I said, after puberty 1 ovum per month is matured and released from the ovaries. Looking at the diagram, we have our oogonium, which are the egg or ovum stem cells, and they will go through mitosis, and so then you get, as you remember from biology, 2 identical diploid cells. One of them stays as a stem cell, another one goes on to go through the cycle. And like we talked about, this happens before birth, and then all of them are arrested in development until puberty, when one of them will develop each month. And so it goes on through meiosis, meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. And so as we know from biology, in meiosis you get 4 different haploid cells. This is a little bit different than spermatogonium, because in this one, the ovum, you actually get only 1 egg, and the other 4 cells are called polar bodies, and the 1 egg gets all of the cytoplasm, all the good stuff, and then the other 3 disintegrate. So looking a little bit more at the diagram, we have our primary oocyte surrounded by the follicle, and then during ovulation it is released, and it actually doesn't go all the way through meiosis until it is penetrated. The plasma membrane of an ovum is penetrated by a sperm, and then it finishes meiosis. So looking at oogenesis, so the ova develop to meiosis 1 by birth and stop, and they are called a primary oocyte, right here. And then about 6 to 12 of the primary oocytes develop each menstrual cycle. Most of them die and degenerate and are reabsorbed by the body. One of them will be released during ovulation. So then, once that 1 ovum undergoes meiosis, you will get 4 daughter cells, but only 1, like we talked about, becomes the ovum and gets all the cytoplasm. The rest of them become polar bodies and degenerate. And we talked about meiosis 2 is not completed until a sperm penetrates the plasma membrane of the ovum. So those are the gonads. Let's talk about the accessory organs of the female reproductive system. Wrong way. So the fimbriae are finger-like projections that sweep the ovum into the uterine tubes. The uterine tubes are also known as fallopian tubes and oviducts. These are small muscular tubes about 12.5 centimeters or 5 inches long, and they connect the ovary to the uterus. But actually, there is no direct contact with of the uterine tubes to the ovary. So when an ovum is released from the ovary, it actually is just released into the abdomen, and then the fimbriae are going to pick it up. So in the uterine tubes, there is beating cilia and also peristalsis that propels the ovum to the uterus. Then there is the uterus. This is located in the pelvis, and it is anterior to the rectum and superior to the bladder. It is about the size of your fist, 7.5 centimeters by 5 centimeters by 2.5 centimeters thick. It is a hollow, thick-walled organ. And the function of the uterus is to nourish the fertilized ovum, also known as an embryo, as it grows. The uterine wall has 3 layers: the perimetrium, myometrium, and the endometrium. The myometrium is a layer of smooth muscle, and then the endometrium is the layer that builds up and is sloughed off every month, and we'll talk more about that later. So endometrium, just as I said, it is an inner mucosal lining, and it builds up during the menstrual cycle and is shed if there's no embryo. Okay, there's also the cervix, which is a tough fibrous ring inferior, which is the inferior tip of the uterus, and it projects into the vagina. So the cervix produces cervical fluid, which provides lubrication and helps nourish and transport sperm to the ovum. So looking at the diagram, we have our ovaries and the fimbriae and the uterine tubes, and then the uterus. As you can see, there are the 3 layers. There is the myometrium, which is the smooth muscle, and that's what contracts during menstruation to get rid of the menstrual fluid, or during birth to expel the fetus, the baby. And then this last layer is the endometrium, and that's the mucosal layer. Okay, so then down here is the cervix and the vagina. So the vagina is a thin-walled muscular tube. It's about 7.5 centimeters or 3 inches long. It is located inferior to the uterus, and then it is anterior to the rectum and posterior to the urethra and the bladder. We will be talking about the external genitalia on the next slide, and then another accessory organ is the mammary glands, or the breasts, and these are actually modified sweat glands, and they are present in both males and females, but they are only functioning in lactating females. So with the external genitalia, the greater vestibular gland is not actually external, but it's close. It is located superiorly and laterally to the vaginal opening, so it is actually kind of up on the side of the vagina. And it will secrete mucus for lubrication during intercourse, and it is very similar to the vulvourethral gland. And then the vulva is the external genitalia, and just to clarify, what you can see is the vulva. It is not the vagina. The vagina is the muscular tube going up into the uterus. So the external genitalia is the vulva. So we'll talk about the mons pubis, which is the fatty pad over the pubic symphysis, and often covered with hair after puberty, I should say. Okay, so the vulva, there is the labia majora, which is the fatty hair-covered skin folds, and the labia minora, which are thinner skin folds, and they are hairless. The clitoris, which is the sensitive erectile tissue, and the vestibule is inside the labia minora, and this houses the external openings of the urethra and the vagina. So the urethral opening is anterior to the vaginal opening, anterior. And then the perineum, which is the entire external pelvic floor in males and in females. So the vulva, the mons pubis, is the fatty pad covered in hair up here over the pubic symphysis. The labia majora, these are the skin folds. They are thicker than the labia minora, and they are covered with hair. And then the labia minora are the internal or more internal skin folds and are not covered in hair. The clitoris is anterior to both the vagina and the urethral opening, and it is the sensitive erectile tissue. The vestibule is this area inside the labia minora that houses the urethral opening and the vaginal opening. And then the perineum is technically this whole area in both men and women. A lot of times people will talk about just this area being the perineum. So that sums up our anatomy of the female reproductive system. In the next video, we're going to talk about the menstrual cycle. Okay, see you then.